Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today we are going to do a hell of a lot of tea spilling because we are going to be talking about the most overrated, what we think are the most overrated albums of 2013. We've been talking a lot about 2013 this year just because a lot of albums are celebrating their 10th anniversary. We've done lots of record clubs on 10th anniversary records. We plan on doing some more. And it's just been an interesting year to reevaluate, to look back on a significant point in the world of music. We've also done an underrated albums video. We did that. We don't want to just be negative Nancy's here on the channel, but we do want to, we don't want to spare any venom on occasion, you know?
And here's the thing is that, like, overrated is one of the most bandied about words in, like, casual music discourse. You know, people say, or not just music, media, people say X is overrated all the time. And that is the complete thought. You know what I mean? And so I feel like the nuances of what that word can mean are a little bit lost, because the way that people treat overrated is that overrated means bad, or more specifically, bad actually. You know, people say X is overrated because people said it was good, but it's actually bad. And that's
not good.
What the word has to mean. You might think something is overrated because it was, you know, it got a glowing reception where it's generally regarded really fondly in the culture, but you despise it. Or you might find that something's overrated because it was held up as the second coming of Christ and you just think it's pretty good. You know, overrated is a relative term. It describes a difference between consensus and between personal subjective positioning. And it doesn't have to be that vast of a gap. So we're going to talk about some albums today that were all very warmly received within the general music critic space of 2013 that we have different opinions on, you know, that we think in some cases, you know, this is good, but just not as good as people said it was, not this totem, or maybe it is good, but it just hasn't aged as well as you maybe would hope it would. Or in some cases, we're going to talk about albums that we just fucking plain old don't like. But in all cases, the commercial and critical stature of these records is that they were really successful in that space in 2013 when they were released. And so the gulf between that and how we feel is going to vary from album to album. It's not going to always be the same. So that's important to establish, I think, because when you're throwing around, you know, this is overrated, people will take those words and they will, you know, they could spin a different meaning out of that. And it's different from what you're actually trying to say. So it's important when you say something is overrated, you express what you mean by that and in what sense it's overrated to you personally. And again, it shouldn't need to be said, but these are all subjective takes. These are all personal opinions. At least one of Jake's picks is actually no, multiple of Jake's picks, maybe even all of them, now that I'm looking at them, are records that I enjoy more than Jake does. And that's okay, because neither of us are correct. We're just expressing a feeling that we feel within our own personal narrative. Things need to be shifted. You know what I mean? Things need to be kind of adjusted from the consensus a bit. So that's what we're getting into today. And with that, Jake, why don't you lead us off with your first pick today for most overrated albums of 2013, the year that was, in which all of these albums are hitting the decade mark. What's your lead off?
I want to preface this. I got really into music in 2016. So the years before that, I need everybody to keep in mind that I don't have as extensive of a catalog of listened albums before the year 2016. So this exercise was exceptionally difficult for me because a lot of the times, you know, like the albums that I've heard from a particular year, I've heard because they are notable in some respect. And I don't like seek out something that is, I'm going to, you know, diverge too heavily from the canon from. So I really had to pick things that were down to the wire. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go about talking about them in escalating order of my complexity in terms of my relationship with them. So I'm going to start out with the thing that I like the least and have the most well-defined opinion on. And here's my lead off. I do not like, have never liked, and have never understood the appeal of Justin Timberlake. Never in my life has the appeal of an artist been more lost on me. The first time I heard a song like Sexy Back, for instance, I was like, what in the hell is this electro clash nightmare of a song? Like, it's got a good hook, but like, aesthetically, it is aesthetically, that song is indicative of everything that I hate about 2000s pop production. Like all that stuff that's like left over from like the like pop music, like absorbing the aesthetic elements of the sort of, you know, the bling era of hip hop, like that very specific moment in time musically, no, absolutely not. I do not care for it at all. And then it all crystallizes in the form of Justin Timberlake, who I got a bone to pick with, honestly. I've never been more exhausted of somebody's like continued cultural existence that somebody is like a sex symbol than Justin Timberlake. Like the whole thing, like the overbearing thing with him is like, again, it's like, isn't he hot? Isn't he sexy? And it's just like, I mean, he's fine. Like, I mean, like he's a guy and he's like, he's always come across as a try-hard to me. And with that, you need like that effortlessly cool music person, Hollywood sexy thing. Like it just doesn't work for me if it feels like you're trying too hard. And that's always the thing I've gotten from Justin. Like past singles of his that are super popular, like Cry Me a River and shit, I find fucking unbearable. I don't like any of them. But that's the thing, is that Justin's boy band roots and that kind of really earlier, like the stuff on his debut album, Justified, that stuff isn't stuff that critics, traditionally speaking, like in a pre-Poptimist world, that they haven't been like super, like they haven't latched onto that stuff. It wasn't until he came out with the album Future Sex Love Sounds where people started to really kind of take him seriously as a voice in pop music. He started appearing a little bit more often, maybe with other songs, just like, you know, he became more of his own cultural presence as he broke away from that initial kind of boy band stuff. And then that album, Future Sex Love Sounds, is, you know, I don't really care for it, but like, you know, it's fine. It's a bit too long, but like whatever. The follow-up, however, in the form of the 2020 Experience in 2013 is my first pick here. And I just decidedly think this album sucks. And it's for more reasons than just the fact that I don't like Justin Timberlake, and just like I find his singing voice kind of cloying in the same way that I find somebody like Sam Smith's voice kind of cloying and annoying, and that it just, you hear that voice and it's like, I feel like I'm in a Kmart. I just want to leave whatever space that I'm in right now.
I'm looking right here.
And it doesn't help that I think this album's absolute it doesn't help that this album's best moments crystallize in the form of the single, the Jay-Z featuring Suit and Tie, which is the best song on here for sure, because it's very slickly produced, you know, it's very like, you know, the jazzy kind of loungy production, you know, very kind of yacht rock adjacent almost, but it's like, it's fine. It's not my bag at all. And I kind of think Jay's verse is phoned in as hell, but I mean, what verse in this era of Jay-Z's career wasn't? But like,
I just want to point out that like this song has a music video directed by David Fincher.
That's fucking right.
And it's like, it is lit like it is Citizen Kane. It fucking owns.
It's great. Right. I will not say nary a word about the directorial work of David Fincher. I mean, you get the guy who made the Vogue music video to do your Suit and Tie music video. You did something right. Again, it's just more of the core problem of the songs that I just don't like Justin. But like, its goal is to be effortlessly cool, and it's does a pretty good job. You know, it's all right. The rest of the album is a bloated, bore. This is, and I know we hammer this point a lot about album length, but hear me out here. This album is 70 minutes. It has 10 songs. Are you fucking kidding? This pop album, song lengths, 8 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 minutes, 7 minutes. Dude, are you fucking kidding me? Like, these songs better be full of I better have an orgasm twice during the duration of every single one of these songs if you want to make them worthwhile. And there's nothing that's that far off from what he was doing beforehand. Again, it's shinier, it's more modern in many respects. The instrumentation in the production has aged very well. The production itself has not, because what, pray tell, makes a 70-minute long album unbearable? The wall of sound that is these mixes. Jesus Christ. I have never in my life felt more like a victim of ear fatigue than I was halfway, not even at the end, fucking halfway into this album. And my why? Like, there's no reason for these instrumentals to sound like this.
What, good?
It's a conscious choice. No, they sound off. These mixes are so bricked and sterile. Oh my God. Like, even the stuff on Suit and Tie is just like, it's almost so slick it becomes its own problem. But that's a relatively self-contained, shorter song on this album. Everything else is long and digressive, and Justin's voice in these mixes that are already too blown out and loud. Oh my God, it's the worst fucking shit. I can't fucking stand it. And this is kind of held up alongside Future Self-Love Sounds as like the imperial era of Justin Timberlake, when he sort of came into his own and got taken seriously by critics, but also still got enough success that like normal everyday people were still listening to songs from this album and enjoying them, and it achieved like huge commercial success. And superficially, I understand, but I just think that even my disdain for Mr. Timberlake aside, everything about this album is going to age fucking horribly 10 years down the line.
Okay. Well, I love the passion. I love the energy you've got here. I'm a big fan. I think you should, I'm glad that you've really, found a way.
But I think you're wrong, you stupid idiot.
Well, yeah. No, I love this album. I think this album sounds great. I don't hear the mixing. It's definitely a loud album. It's definitely an in-your-face album. I don't mind that the songs are as long as they are, because they're all constructed as these really rich and, sort of saucy jams, frankly, that I really, really enjoy. But I will say, I definitely agree that this is one of the most overrated albums of 2013, because if you were there and if you remember what it was like to be reading, Pitchfork or whoever when this came out, they weren't talking about this shit like it was the second coming. Like, this was so overhyped to the point where by the end of the year, it didn't even take the whole year, but by the end of the year, Pitchfork were backpedaling on this. And part of the fact that happened was that Justin released a second album, the 2020 Experience.
Oh yeah,
2 of 2, which is even longer and is, coming from me, someone who really enjoys the 2020 Experience, turgid. Right? You have songs that are, there's 11-minute songs on that album. It's unbelievable.
That's like a 1-star album. Sucks ass.
It's not the worst thing in the world, but it is a lot more lackluster. But yeah, I enjoy the original 2020 Experience a lot, especially songs like Push Your Love Girl and Tunnel Vision, Strawberry Bubblegum, the closing run, Let the Groove Get In, Mirrors, and especially Blue Ocean Floor, which is a gorgeous way to end the album.
Sucks.
Just really adore those songs. But yeah, it's definitely one of those albums that you look back at 2013 and you look back at what people were talking about, what critics were talking about, and you're like, well, okay. And certainly it doesn't help that Justin's kind of shot his cachet in the foot with Man of the Woods and still hasn't really recovered from that. But my advice would have been drop the just 2020 experience. It's cleaner.
I would say even drop experience. Like I mean that's sort of like self-evident, it's an album that is an experience.
If it's an experience, I should be able to know that,
Yeah.
So for my picks, I'm going to do a kind of similar thing to you, Jake, where I've got 3 like you, and I'm going to sort of increase in my complexity of how I feel. So I'm going to start with the album that I have the least complicated thoughts on, and like you, the album I have the most disdain for. In fact, 2 of the albums I'm going to talk about today, I generally like. I just think have
me too.
I think have big problems that were completely overlooked in the way that the album was talked about at the time. But the first album I'm going to talk about today is not one of those albums, because this is an album I fucking hate. And every single person in the world loves. Maybe not every single person, but like 80% of people love this. You're not helping my point, but thank you. And that is
every single person without a margin for error loves this album. Like, I don't know, I'm not that big on it. Fuck!
Look, it's just the one album from 2013 where I am in that position that I know that you two get sometimes with something big and Titanic that you just can't connect with, where I'm just like, what do you see in this? And so my first pick is Chance the Rapper's Acid Rap, which is a mixtape, but still one of the biggest albums of the year, or biggest releases of the year.
Oh yeah.
Like Justin Timberlake, Chance's critical cachet, and I suppose more so his commercial cachet, because Justin still can fairly easily have a hit if he wants to, but Chance is gone. Chance is going to need a really big comeback arc. Like, people have gone so off.
Dead's dead, baby.
It wasn't just that the whole debacle with the Big Day that tanked Chance. It was just the fact that what the charisma and personality that Chance was banking on is the kind of thing that is not sustainable and gets old quick. And that personality and that style and that whole thing that he has is what is basically the entirety of what acid rap is predicated on. And it is this, God, it's so annoying, nasally delivery where every other song he's doing that Cartman and that's, I'm not exaggerating, he does that on multiple points across the record. And it's not just that, it's what that is representing, which is the way that Chance comes across on this mixtape, which is just unbearable for me, cloying, in your face. It's like sugary, sentimental, but with nothing to back it up. Now, I admit, a lot of what people love about this album isn't just Chance. It's the way that it sounds. It's a very warm and richly produced jazz rap record. There's a lot of, color and depth and animation to these songs musically. There's a lot to get on board with on that level. And Chance was kind of putting it out there and putting it in your face and matching it with the kind of personality that you wouldn't typically get from music that luxurious, right? He was adding an energy to it that I know a lot of people responded to. It just so happens that I find that energy to be completely unbearable. I find him to be willfully asinine at almost every turn. I mean, look at a song like Lost, which, the hook on the song, my druggie, love me when I'm ugly, hug me when I'm bummy, scummy, I'm your hubby. And that's the hook. And he does it over and over again. And he's just singing this, that's how he sounds the whole fucking time. I can't stand it. There are some bright spots. I think that Good Ass Intro is a pretty good way to kick it off. And he actually has a really good flow on this track. He has a nice amount of energy. I can see the vision with Chance here. Similarly, I think Favorite Song with Childish Gambino, who I also have complicated thoughts on. But this is a pretty good track. I think the hook works well here. The energy's great here. Acid Rain's probably the best song on the whole thing as well. One of my favorite instrumentals on the whole record. Just really kind of cold, but like enveloping in a way that I really, really love. But I mean, if I'm to try and justify why critics especially were going fucking bug nutty for this in 2013, beyond that, it completely falls apart. I don't see the appeal of a song like Cocoa Butter Kisses or Juice. Both of those songs I know were the bigger songs for Chance off of this project. I mean, Cocoa Butter Kisses is all right. Juice, I fucking miss me with that shit. I cannot get into it. Nano with Action Bronson. I mean, it's fucking impressive to make me have disdain for a song with Action Bronson on it. But they fucking managed. Smoke Again with Absol is unbearable as well. You know, once upon a time, I did like Chance. You know, 2016, when Coloring Book came out, I was on the train. I found that record to be really, really fun and exciting, especially the big singles for that. And so I don't know how to reconcile that with the fact that Chance hasn't really changed, or didn't really change dramatically between these two releases. But there's just, and maybe it's the collective trauma of what we did with The Big Day that's sunken this for me permanently. But I've gone back to this multiple times this month to prepare for this conversation, to just to find something. And I've said the things I think are good about it. I found those things. But my God, are they swamped? Are they dwarfed by Chance's shtick? Like his whole style, his whole presence, his presentation, his personality, just it's like cilantro gene shit. I cannot get it anymore. It's gone for me, unfortunately. And so if you love this album, like, I'm not coming at you personally. A lot of people do. Like, I want to believe, I want to be there, I want to be able to get on that level with you, but I just can't, unfortunately. Acid Rat is a huge miss for me, and I will never understand the hype. I can understand people finding Chance maybe promising, or people kind of enjoying this broadly, but just the way in which this was talked about as one of the hip-hop events of 2013 just boggles me. What is your second pick today, Jake?
I don't dislike this album, but I fail to see what is in any way remarkable about it. I mean, no point in parrying the this is Drake's Nothing Is the Same, or Nothing Was the Same, whatever the hell. Y'all know what I'm talking about. Like, what are we gonna say that you don't already think that we feel about Drake? He's become a parody of himself. Like, his albums are all way too long, filled with filler. He can still make hits, but they're, 2% of what he makes overall. He's kind of an unbearable social media presence now, and the people are generally just pretty fucking tired of him, I would say, even though he's still successful enough to keep himself afloat as basically the biggest musician in the world right now. And I think that this is sort of a moment in his career, Nothing Was the Same, where it really, he really is riding off of the back of Take Care, which I think everybody would agree is probably his best album. But this is when he started to be taken a lot more seriously. That sort of swell of the same indie blogs that he was like, it was kind of a nexus that he would bring up. Artists like The Weeknd are now so big that his sound, when he takes from The Weeknd, is then further amplified by the critical consensus that he started to form after Take Care, which I think that album's pretty good, honestly. Like, that's his best album to me. I don't love it, but there are some great songs on there. Like the title track, for instance, I think is Drake's best song. And yeah, so again, never let it be said that I don't have anything good to say about Drake. And then he follows it up with Nothing Is the Same, and I don't get it. The thing is that this album really isn't too long. It just has too many songs that don't fucking do anything. Like, I like songs like Furthest Thing, From Time, Hold On, We're Going Home was a pretty big song. And like, everything else is just so fucking standard. There's just there's nothing, like, again, this is what makes it so difficult, is just that, like, there's nothing here that earns this a pulse. I find the production to be mostly kind of murky and gray and flavorless. I think that songs like Started from the Bottom are flat out fucking terrible. Like, the hook is awful, the actual lyricism is boring as shit. Like, fucking stuff on here like Own It, Jesus Christ. I simultaneously understand why the high points are there, even though they're not necessarily like they don't hugely work for me. But I don't know. It just, I fail to see what puts this on the sort of same level as his other well-liked projects. Like, I don't get it.
Jake, I got you here, all right? Because I disagree, but I feel like I can hopefully paint a full picture. I've greatly enjoyed, in a kind of schadenfreude way, you try very generously to attempt to kind of give this or really understand where a lot of the love for Drake at this particular point came from, even though it's really amusing how just like visibly disdainful you are towards him in just every respect. Like, you fucking hate Drake. I know you despise him. I know that every single time you try to say something nice about him, it is through gritted teeth. And I know, and that's fine. That's how you feel, and I can see why, being into music for the period that you've been into, which has mostly been, post Drake's golden era, the way he's been in the last, 7 years or so, basically ever since Views, particularly in the way where he's kind of, ever since Views, he's just sort of operated by the saturation model, where it's just a new record or a new release of some kind every year, and it's just more and more and more and more and more, while at the same time being commercially and culturally inescapable. So Drake is exhausting and annoying and not in a particularly interesting creative place. That's fair. But as someone who was into Drake when this came out, being into Drake during that Take Care, Nothing Was the Same era, and what I mean by that is just kind of listening to the records as opposed to just kind of hearing the big singles. It's hard to imagine now from where we are right now, but Drake in the early 2010s was actually one of the more charismatic and enticing and interesting personalities in hip hop, and one of the ones who a lot of people, myself included, felt that it was really easy to form a connection with Drake, because the way he was talking about his life, and it wasn't that you connected with his particular lifestyle, because of course we didn't, none of us were, it's not that we could relate to Drake's life, but it's that he talked about and he introspected on his feelings and on his relationships and on his experiences in a way that was much more unguarded and much more divorced from any kind of dressed up, fictionalized drama than a lot of the artists prior to him. He was just very candid about his personal life and his relationships in a way that didn't constantly focus on reinforcing basic masculine stereotypes. That's not to say Drake didn't reinforce those stereotypes at certain points in his music. He did, but he was more than just those stereotypes in the way that he talked about his relationships. Drake got in his feelings, and Drake spoke about the way he was feeling inside in a particular sphere, in a particular place, at a particular cultural moment where that was really novel. And that really stood out. And that was one of the things that made Drake so attractive. And also he did that, and he made these really warm, introspective and hushed tracks that kind of pulled you into his world and felt really immersive in a way that you wouldn't really expect from an artist like him, or that felt particularly like, that had a real appeal to people, especially people who were consuming albums and looking for those kinds of experiences from their records. I mean, it's one of the things that makes Take Care so great is, you have huge, enormous songs like the title track on that record, but you also have Marvin's Room, one of his most celebrated songs, which is this, really introspective and emotionally ugly, expression of his frustrations and his grievances and about his relationships. Nothing Was the Same is very much riding off the coattails of Take Care, and it's not as strong a record as Take Care in the sense that it doesn't quite have the same identity that record has, but it also was more commercially successful for Drake than Take Care was. Take Care was kind of the pinnacle of his critical acclaim, and then Nothing Was the Same was kind of when he started reaching his commercial, pinnacle, which would sustain for many years beyond then. And so critics were still with him at this point. He was bigger than ever. These were inescapable. I have vivid memories of, it's being at school balls, dancing to Hold On, We're Going Home, which is the early 2010s equivalent of The Weeknd's I Feel It Coming, which I feel like no one ever talks about how much that song owes to Hold On, We're Going Home. They're both great, and I love them both dearly. Furthest Thing, which you already mentioned, is another just one of my favorite Drake songs. Tuscan Leather. I mean, it's all, Drake's completely insular. He's completely contained in his creative style at this point. Like, he's working with 40 exclusively almost. He's figured out what he wants to do and how he wants to sound. He's got a really kind of intimate process in that regard. I mean, there's features on this record, but there's really not that many, and most of them are vocal features as opposed to kind of rap features as well. It's very much Drake's world. I'll Ride for started from the bottom, just because that song has such nostalgia for me of like being 16 in school, hearing that coming through a phone speaker. And I'll be honest, I put this on and that song starts and I just start moving. The groove is really irresistible for me on that song. Worst Behavior, Wu-Tang Forever, love those songs. From Time with Janae Aiko's great. But all of this stuff doesn't matter for me compared to one song. My favorite Drake song, one of my favorite songs of 2013, Too Much with Sampha. This song breaks my heart. First of all, it was my introduction to Sampha, who I think is one of the best vocalists, producers that we have working today, and easy to underestimate because he doesn't release much music, but when he does, it's always stunning. I think a lot of people really kind of globbed onto him from Saint Pablo on the Life of Pablo by Kanye, which was just before he released his debut studio album. But he was, collaborating with artists like Drake and Subtract way before then. And Too Much is a song that is anchored by his vocal performance, which is just heart-rending. And then the way that Sampha and 40 together cut that up into a beat over which Drake just drops some just genuinely emotionally intense bars. At one point talking about, his mother's struggle with depression and just generally all the things that are clouding over him. Like, that song to me is immortal and eternal, and I will always get really, really emotional when I listen to it. The album has duds, for sure. It's not a great album. It's an album that has great moments, and that it's an album that captures where Drake was at this kind of golden point where you could put up with the filler because it was just cool to hear Drake being Drake. And as hard as that may be to relate to now, I do think that Own It and Connect and 305 to My City are bad songs, basically. But I still don't find it difficult to listen to Nothing Was the Same from front to back. So this is going to be probably the biggest. Well, no, it's not the biggest point in which we disagree, but I guess I'm more passionate in my disagreement than I was with Justin Timberlake, because I was in my introspective white boy shit when this came out, and I cannot pretend to be above that or to be rewriting history, because I would be lying to you. I just had to put my neck out there and say that there'll always be a part of me that has a fondness for Drake, and maybe it's only possible if you connected with him in some way before he became what he is now, ripped and hench. And
you said that like you were... You said that like you were speaking about like your apprentice who's become evil, and like
yeah.
There's like a visible crack in your voice. Oh,
Anyway,
ooh, you were my brother, Anakin. I loved you.
Drake is truly the Anakin Skywalker of modern hip hop.
Look, this is always going to be the Drake album I'm most likely to listen to in full. It is because it's the least, overlong, pretty comfortably. Mm-hmm. But I just have a real strong attachment to like 70% of it. Anyway, let's move on, and I'll get into my second pick, which is, again, this is an album I like. I've talked about it in a previous Now episode this year, and I kind of went in depth there, so I won't repeat myself too much, because my complicated feelings are actually not that hard to express, which makes them sound like they're not complicated, but they are. The record is Vampire Weekend's Modern Vampires of the City, which was voted the greatest album of 2013 in Pitchfork's year-end list that year. Although if they had written that list after Beyonce released her self-titled, based on how they reviewed that album, I'm sure that would have taken the cake. But it was pretty confidently one of the most critically revered albums that year. I think that the first half of this record is impeccable. The first 6 songs on Modern Vampires of the City is the zenith of Vampire Weekend. It is the fully realized potential of those 2 previous records, which are nice, sunshiny pop albums that are heavily indebted to Paul Simon, that nevertheless feel like they lack a kind of low end and a kind of scope and scale in the sound that Modern Vampires of the City completely realizes. The first 6 songs are joyous for me as a person who likes those 2 previous records a lot. You know, Obvious Bicycle is just a warm, enveloping intro. Unbelievers and Step are just like gorgeous, with like harpsichords and pianos and really ornate, lush instrumentation and really funny and witty lyrics from Ezra Koenig. Diane Young is a fucking bananas song, like 2.5 minutes of just the zaniest shit you've ever heard, and it never fails to put a complete smile on my face. Like, that song, I cannot describe that song. You have to hear that to believe what it is. Don't Lie is where the album's main theme, which is a really big preponderance with sort of existential dread, starts to seep through. And then Hannah Hunt is the best Vampire Weekend song. A lot of people will tell you that, and I will back it up. That song is a muted ballad that ends or climaxes with a moment of just overwhelming emotional catharsis that everyone who was into this in 2013 will rave at you about if you give them the opportunity. And it's not that the rest of the album is bad, it's just that it kind of falls apart. You know, Everlasting Arms, the 7th song, is probably the best on the back half. It's more muted, it's prettier. It's again quite lyrically strong as well in terms of Ezra's preoccupation with faith as it relates to his existential dread. It's a good song, I think. Then you have Finger Back and Worship You, and Yahweh, which are like, Finger Back is like everything that could go wrong with Ezra Koenig's vocal style going wrong. Like, that song is just grating beyond belief, even though I really like Rostam's production on the really loud shuffling beat. It's just a really nasal and annoying song with a grating and cloying bridge and sort of spoken word section in the middle that I don't care for all that much. Worship You is just sounds really bad, which is a really glib way of saying I don't like it, but it's unfortunate for me to be saying that about a Rostam produced song. Yahweh is it's not.
Why would you invoke Outcast like this?
It just never recovers, unfortunately. And I know a lot of people who will defend songs like Yahweh and Hudson and Worship You, and I don't like. I get it, I do. It's just, it feels like all the eccentricity and all the charm gets turned so far up that the charm kind of becomes overwhelmed, and the whole thing kind of develops an air of overly precocious self-concern and just sort of kind of gets drowned in itself. And then the whole record just kind of ends with Hudson and Young Lion, where it's kind of just the album peters out in a way that you don't expect it to. It's one of the most frustrating albums that I maybe have ever talked about on the show in any capacity, because I genuinely love, like, that first half is just bang, 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 home run, home run, home run, home run, home run, and then the best song they've ever made. and the rest of it's just anywhere between fine and surprisingly dull for something that's so adventurous with their sound as this is. And they've never really recovered from that, frankly, because then Rostam left the band, and Father of the Bride, I don't like that album. I'll leave it there. So I still have a lot of fondness for Vampire Weekend. I understand why there was so much hype around this album, but my God, it's a record of two halves, and the second half really plays against that broader appeal, I think, in a way that harms it, for me anyway.
If you're a fan of Vampire Weekend and this album in particular, feel free to write whatever I have to say about this off completely, because I haven't heard the album in full. I've always known that Vampire Weekend annoys the shit out of me. Just the proliferation of a song like A-Punk and just this sort of attitude of their music and the concentrated sunniness of their sort of particular brand of 500 days of summer kind of eccentricity. I got through, I don't know, I don't think I got to Hannah Hunt, but I mean, it's roughly the first half of this album when we were first conceptualizing this video. And I simply turned it off because nothing I was going to have to say about it in a full critical capacity was going to be fair, or this shit annoys me.
Yeah, look, hey, if you weren't enjoying it by that point, it wasn't going to get better for you.
No. And it's kind of difficult to identify what about this band in particular just annoys the hell out of me in comparison to bands of similar flavors.
I always think of Vampire Weekend as kind of being what the 1975 are before that, because their whole identity when they first came up was like, we're these really self-aware college kids who are making this kind of like really plucky, very basic but very shiny pop that has this kind of like, undertone of like, we're very literate and very educated and we're very cognizant of the ways in which we're playing with the tropes and history of pop music, yada 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 style thing. And I think that, knowing you, Morgan, the difference between the two bands is just that the 1975 style and approach and the way that they make music is just a little bit more in your wheelhouse than the bongo-laden, chirpy, the whole thing that Vampire Weekend do just kind of leans a little bit more into the, we're highly educated, shtick, which has always been the thing that people who don't like this band have thrown at them, is that they're so self-indulgent and up their own asses about like everything that influences them and all the Ezra's lyrics and all that kind of stuff. Just the whole atmosphere of it, leaves a lot of people cold.
I feel like stuff on this album in particular reminded me of, like, it brought to mind like gentrified Velvet Underground, and it's like, it's so clean.
You're gentrifying a band of white people.
You would not think it possible, would you? But here's Ezra. I don't know. Fuck him. I don't fucking like that motherfucker. I have no basis for that other than I find his voice and general demeanor infuriating.
Yeah, he's just like he's the kind of guy who's always wearing a different scarf every time you see him.
Oh god, I wouldn't fucking hold him under the water until the bubbles stop. It's a similar thing I get with Panic at the Disco, even like their good material, where I'm just like, I hate your vibe, and I can't.
I kind of like that, like Panic at the Disco for indie rock people, That's
God,
what they are. It's not that they sound similar, it's just that the kind of place they come from and the appeal they have, the way in which their theatrical and literate interests are such a core part of their personality is not dissimilar.
And that the white women loved them both.
Anyway, let's get to our last picks today. Jake, what is your third pick for the most overrated albums of 2013?
I don't like doing this for especially a video like this, because picking a polarizing album is kind of an easy grab, because it's like, well, it's polarizing, so clearly it just didn't work for me. But it also just, it can't be understated how I feel like this is the progenitor of a phenomenon that occurred in the 2010s that I feel like set a kind of precedent, especially with this artist in this phase of their career, that just kind of began where I personally began to fall off with this person, artistically speaking. And I couldn't say no to it just because it is widely, I mean, like, if you had to like take a survey of music fans and you would tell you like, hey, what's the best album of 2013? A good amount of them, if not most of them, would probably say Kanye West's Yeezus. And look, I get it. I do. And I feel like Yeezus, in many respects, only gets better the more time goes on. It's just that it doesn't get good enough. Like, it's a lot better in the respect that I think that, to put it concisely, it's 40 minutes. And when you're Kanye West after this album, length begins to be a bit of a problem for you. Hell, even sometimes he can like veer on the side of making albums that are too short to register as being substantial. But with Yeezus, it's kind of by design, at least. It's this out there for Kanye, very extreme, very digital, very id-driven record, intentionally veering into this primordial, almost industrial place. And he's still kind of Kanyeing it up with the hooks. Like, I mean, there are songs on here like Black Skinhead, for example. I really like Black Skinhead. It's not fucking Stairway to Heaven, but it knocks. And that's kind of my defense for a lot of the good songs on here, in my opinion. On Site, also, like the blaring fucking synths that are on this. Hell yeah, absolutely. Go for it. And, you know, the stuff like The Closer, Bound 2, I think is also just like good classic Kanye. It's got some more extreme production flourishes, but it's mostly good for the reason that most early Kanye stuff is pretty good. But there's some undeniable problems with this. One of them being that in the pursuit of making this album kind of, you know, id-driven, single-minded, it's also kind of fucking boring. The production certainly kind of makes up for this in many respects. And I'm not saying that there isn't, like, it's totally absent of self-examination or deeper themes, but what I am saying is that Kanye fails to make them interesting. The writing on here is just like, when it's not blunt for the purpose of hitting you, I don't care. I couldn't be less involved with the Kanye personality, you know, or cult of personality thing. And I feel like this is the phase of his career where that becomes kind of integral to his appeal. Far more so on his next record than on this. This is a bit more of a standalone effort, I think. But there's also kind of reasons that I feel like nobody talks about songs like Send It Up or Guilt Trip, for instance. When was the last time those entered the best Kanye song conversations?
Well, here's the thing with Yeezus. I feel like more than anything else Kanye has done, Yeezus, for each individual person who listens to it, is a mirror for, and so how you feel about Kanye West at any given time is how you will feel about Yeezus. You ask someone at a particular point in time how they feel about Kanye and how they feel about Yeezus, and those things will be more or less aligned. It doesn't so much matter with Yeezus whether every song works, because Yeezus is not an album about the songs, really. It's an album about Kanye being as honest as he's ever been about who he really is and about how the inside of his mind works. There is less, to me, constructed artifice on this album than any other Kanye record. And that's why however you feel about Kanye at any given time will be how you feel about this. And if you have complicated feelings about Kanye, you'll probably have complicated feelings about Yeezus. If Kanye's imperfections, and again, that's a word that's doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, if Kanye's imperfections are something that you are personally able to overlook or willing to overlook for the greater, you know, importance of what his art is to you, then Yeezus will probably be one of your favorite Kanye releases, because it just so thoroughly imbues all of the complications of the man, but puts them in a particular light of simultaneous celebration and decrying that it's just everything that Kanye is. I'm trying to say this without becoming incoherent, but like that's what Yeezus is to me. It's a total mirror for how an individual person feels about Kanye at any single point in time. And so in terms of overrated albums, this album got well, actually, it wasn't that this album was universally lauded. There were definitely detractors in the critical circles when this album came out, but the vast majority of the reception was positive. And let's be honest, a lot of the time when we talk about overrated in a critical sense at this particular juncture in history, we're using Pitchfork as a guiding stick. You know, they gave this the 9.5. It was, I think that was the highest rating they gave to any album in 2013, even though they put Modern Vampires of the City at number 1. This, you know, album was a critical wet dream, you know, because not just because all the critics loved it, but because it was an album that was just so begging to be dissected and so explosive and so overflowing. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of where Yeezus is that if you think Kanye is the greatest of all time, you'll think Yeezus is a pinnacle of art. If you think Kanye is unbearable and overrated and awful, you will hate Yeezus. If you're somewhere in between, you will fall somewhere in between with Yeezus. It is that kind of album, I think.
I really hate to say this, but I do think that Donda is a better album. And the reason that I think that is that I just think the highlights are way more substantive. Like, if I pick out my favorite songs from each of these, my favorite songs on Donda are ones that I prefer light years ahead of the ones on here. So that's like, it's a simple take, but I nonetheless hold it. The other thing is that, again, this isn't really Kanye's fault, and I feel like this is somewhat overstated with people who don't love this album, but when it comes to getting my fill of industrial hip-hop, I got death grips and clipping, man. Yeah. I'm good. Like, this simply is an album that wants to operate in an avenue of extremes, and for Kanye, it absolutely does. For the world of wider music as a whole, it is very difficult for me to listen to a lot of this and be like, oh, wow, this is so out there, when I have stuff that, like, you know, is actually out there.
And then there, that's the thing. The thing is, you don't listen to the Yeezus when you want to listen to an industrial hip-hop record. You listen to Yeezus when you want to listen to Kanye West. Like, that's the difference.
Precisely.
The genre of this album is Kanye.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Exactly.
You can make reference points to industrial hip-hop, and I think it's pretty clear he was drawing at least some degree from Death Grips. It's really funny that he recruited Daft Punk to kind of approximate that, which I think is a really savvy move, because they used to be in their early days like really noisy, and I think Death Grips draw a lot from them. But I'm getting down the rabbit hole. That's what Yeezus is. So I think it's a really interesting and useful like yardstick for talking about Kanye in any respect.
I want to pose a question. It's well known now that Yeezus at the last minute, because like this had an insane album rollout, but it's well known now that basically half of the track list for this was cut at more or less the insistence of producer and collaborator Rick Rubin, just being like, hey, this is too unwieldy. We need to cut this down to its more essential tracks. And he did, and that's what we got. Where do you think, if at all, this would occupy? If the, like, I know it's hard just because obviously we haven't heard those tracks. We don't know what this version of the album, but like the bigger, unwieldier, Donda-esque album being released at this juncture in Kanye's career, do you think that would have altered the trajectory of how this was received, or even
Absolutely
how Kanye
not.
was received?
Absolutely not. It's not.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because I don't either.
It's not the length. That whole thing has nothing to do with it. It's about
it's kind of because the music doesn't matter that much.
Well, I think
it's not to say it's bad. I'm just saying it doesn't matter.
I think it matters, but not like on a specific sense. Like, it matters that in this song he did this. there are elements where you point to
Yeah.
these are things that are emblematic of the album, like the drums on Black Skinhead, or the bass synth on New Slaves, or the Nina Simone sample and the Tonight Horns on Blood on the Leaves. There's moments that you can point to and say these are musically emblematic, but it's the totality of it that is what people enjoy. That's why, whether a couple of songs are iffy or whatever, it just doesn't matter when you're enjoying the album on that level. All right. My final pick today is an album that I actually had Jake listen to this so that we could have a bit of a conversation about it. It's an album.
By the way, I would like to point out that I did not know that this was a double album until last night.
Yeah. Well,
fun to learn.
Okay, so we're good at saying a lot of things before we actually say what the album is. So my final pick today is Arcade Fire's Reflektor. Picture this. Not hard to picture, I'm sure. 2013, 16-year-old me loves Arcade Fire. Just fucking rides hard in the paint for Arcade Fire. Had a transformative experience with Funeral. Loves Neon Bible. Thinks that the suburbs is like the sound of my heart singing, all that kind of shit. Love Arcade Fire. Everyone loves Arcade Fire. Arcade Fire in 2013 pre-Reflektor, especially coming off the back of the suburbs, are kind of a really hard band to hate because they're so hard on sleeve, but at the same time, they bring the anthems along as well. And it's so, it's making the intimate but universal feel like, IMAX scale. And they were so good at that. And Reflektor comes along and it's like, what if we take that anthemic quality? It's like, it's U2, but it's indie rock. It's not as pretentious and concerned about worldly issues. It's from
Springsteen, if it was art pop.
Yeah, fuck, that's exactly right. It's like the suburbs is so Springsteen coded. Like, that's where Arcade Fire were at that time. And it was just, it was hard not to be on board with that. And the prospect of Reflektor is so exciting. And what if we take that, but we get James Murphy from LCD Sound System to produce like 80% of the album, and we go in a full tilt, like disco direction with like tinges of funk and reggae and garage rock, and we like do 16 different genres on the thing, but we make it huge and it's hard to resist. Like, obviously it's going to sound like a mess, but it's exciting. And don't get me wrong, Reflektor is a really exciting record, and it's a record that has enormous highs that fully live up to the promise of what an Arcade Fire experience should give you. And it's an album I have a lot of fondness for. When this came out, I had the fucking iTunes pre-order, man. I was on the iPod Touch day of release. I was fucking jamming that shit. I think that was it was actually around the time that I had like exams at school, like end of year exams. The album came out in the last week of October in 2013. And so it was my whole fucking life outside of studying was listening to this fucking album. And fucking making my friends listen to this album and shit. And it was my whole identity. And I fully connected with the hype as well. Again, Pitchfork, I think, gave it a 9.2, I want to say. It was around like that. It was really, it was just the hype was there and everyone was on board. It was just so hard to resist embracing all of its craziness, especially with that title track, which was, the first big teaser we got of the record. And it's one of their biggest and best songs. I think it's a 7-minute multi-part opus, part Bohemian Rhapsody and part Station to Station with a David Bowie feature in it. It's just, that song to me still feels like musical possibility, and it all comes together so beautifully. And you had, I think there was like a short film they released that had loads of celebrity cameos where they were playing certain songs. I could go into the history forever. The reality of Reflektor is that it is a mess, and it is full of signs of what was to come for Arcade Fire as well. It was easy to overlook at the time, but now in a post everything now world, and a post Wii world as well, but more so everything now, because the worst aspects of this record are things that would come to be the great defining aspects of the tire fire that was everything now. It's hard to overlook those things, and it's hard for the weaker and the more trivial and the more society.com aspects of this album. They just so much more. And so Reflektor is a great song. Album starts off really great, and my feelings on this broadly are kind of like my Vampire Weekend feelings, but the inverse, in the sense that I think that this album is a really great second half and a near disastrous first half. It's just slightly easier to overlook that because Reflektor is the first song, and that's amazing. So you kind of are off to a really good start. You have We Exist, which is, for its time, was quite a progressive song. And not that, artists weren't being progressive in 2013. This was the year of Same Love. But still, this is Arcade Fire's Same Love. This is an LGBTQ anthem with a now infamous video in which Andrew Garfield plays a trans woman. And honestly, the most cringe thing about that video is not that Andrew Garfield plays a trans woman, but that the video ends with the trans woman character joining Arcade Fire on stage, and that being their kind of like, the highlight of their life sort of thing. Or like,
so you too can be sexually harassed by Win Butler. Fuck me.
I haven't even like alluded to how that's aged with all the Win Butler shit. So like there's that. And then you have a stretch of songs on this record from Flashbulb Eyes. Well, it's really from me, it's from Flashbulb Eyes through to You Already Know, but you could extend that to Joan of Arc as well if you don't like that song. But really it's Flashbulb Eyes, Here Comes the Nighttime, Normal Person. These three songs that they make me crazy. They make me insane. What is going on?
Normal Person is so fucking awful, man.
The intro to the song, and let me just get into character here. Do you like rock and roll music? Because I don't know if I do.
Just stop that immediately.
If you haven't heard it, I promise you that is exactly how it sounds. That intro.
I have no trouble believing you.
That is anything as strange as a normal person. In retrospect, it's not a million miles away from the sentiment of a song like Modern Man off of The Suburbs, but that song is just so much more graceful in its execution of that very like, unsubtle idea than a song like Normal Person, which is just like, we can be garage rock and we can get stronky guitars and we can kind of do a lo-fi thing, but it's hi-fi, but it sounds lo-fi. And then and going into one of the funniest moments in the album, which is when You Already Know starts with like the UK comedian turned talk show host Jonathan Ross introducing the band at the start of the song. Arcade Fire! It's just that part always seems to me. But Here Comes the Nighttime. I've skipped it. I actually had a conversation with someone on Twitter who loves this song, who thinks this is one of the best songs in the album. And like, I get it. It's really,
I understand.
It's like really creative in its genre fusions. It's pulling from reggae and dancehall and funk and electro and disco, and it's pulling them all together into this, whirlpool of sounds. It's a cacophony for me personally.
It's a disaster.
It's not as bad as Flashbulb Eyes, which is legitimately an astonishingly terrible song. What if the camera really do take your soul? Oh no!
I'm not kidding. I almost kind of respect Flashbulb Eyes because it is so incoherent, it almost feels daring.
Well, and the thing is, like, it's easy to like sort of write off Flashbulb Eyes, just say this is a misstep. If it weren't for the fact that like 7 songs on Everything Now sound exactly like this. It was not a one-off. That all said, I think the reason why I have complicated feelings is that I really love the second half of this record. Awful Sound onwards, I think that the band
it's very good.
Find a way to synthesize all of these different places that they're pulling from into something that really feels like the successor to The Suburbs, that feels like that's the ambition that the record promised, cohering into these really like massive and sweeping songs. I mean, Awful Sound is like it's colliding the last several Beatles albums into one massive, celebration of psychedelic rock with an
Arcade Fires all around the world.
It's awesome. It's never
It is.
over.
It's really great.
It's Never Over, which is kind of the sister song because they're both linked by like a retelling of the myth of Orpheus through the voices of married couple Win and Regine. I love the booming synth pop pulse of It's Never Over. This was when the album came out, this was my favorite song on it. I completely adore that bounce that this thing has, as well as the darkness. Even the really seedy porno, which has its tongue so far in cheek it's penetrating the skin, is something I have a great deal of fondness for, even if some of the lyrics are kind of hard to take given what we know about Win now. And of course Afterlife, which is such a huge song for them. Everyone loves Afterlife. It's huge, it's great, it's awesome, it's fantastic. And then Supersymmetry, which is a beautiful outro, so beautiful that Spike Jonze would reuse it in Her. In fact, actually, I think that I'm fucking the timeline up here because I'm pretty sure they were recruited to do the soundtrack for Her before this even came out. But this whole era of Arcade Fire is so swept up in that movie as well for me. But yeah, it's an album that I loved so much at the time, and the parts of it that have aged poorly have aged so poorly that, to me, if we're talking about overrated albums of 2013, it doesn't get messier, it doesn't get more fucking all over the place than Reflektor.
Yeah, I more or less like take away the fact that I obviously was not there when this album dropped, so obviously I'm not going to have the same level of fondness for it that you do, but like, take in mind the fact that absolutely fucking ravaged last year, and that I sat down, listened to this whole album last night immediately after seeing that it was 85 fucking minutes and that it was contentious. And so I was like, I really don't want to do this, but I'm gonna. And it's a mixed bag for sure, but I enjoyed it more than I didn't. It has that weird arc where I do think it starts out super strong, and it's like it's a reverse bell curve of enjoyment, in that it's just like great, and then it ends great. Like it's astonishing. Like, I don't think I've ever experienced an album with this like smooth of a gradual like descent and then ascent back to like Afterlife, which is probably at present my favorite Arcade Fire song. Like, I mean, the best thing about this album is that it is consistently produced fucking amazingly. Like, even when there is a cacophony of noises, they're great noises. Like, it's an amazing sounding album that, like, at the end of the day, it is that kind of double album masterpiece that even if it basically works as often as it doesn't, it's still a worthwhile endeavor for what great elements you get out of it.
And you don't get James Murphy behind the boards and have something that sounds shitty. Like, he's just too...
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it's still an album that inspires divisive and complicated feelings from audiences, which is something I really appreciate about it. But it is funny, it's funny for me, having been there, remembering how just ungodly heaped with praise this was, and also just how, just because this is the thing with Arcade Fire, is every record they do, I suppose We is an exception to this because they kind of pitched that in a more low-key way, but with albums like Suburbs and Reflektor and everything now, there's so much pomp and circumstance coming around the promotion of it, and everything's huge, and there's hundreds of thousands of dollars poured into it, and it's awesome to, like, artists who have the ability to do that are awesome in that sense. Like, you look up to that and it's so exciting, no matter how you feel about the music itself. But it is funny looking back now with some distance and having seen this band flame so just unbelievably hard into irrelevance, and then just torpitude with these allegations about Win Butler and this current state of the band, that it just Reflektor becomes all the more fascinating as this snapshot of an in-between point of how you get from the suburbs, which is like a fucking Springsteen, The River, to everything now, which is Cut the Crap by The Clash, you know? It's how you... And in the middle, you have Reflektor. And that's inherently exciting and fascinating and complicated. Let us know at home what you think of these albums that we have talked about today. What side of the fence do you fall on? Do you agree with us that any of these are underrated, or do you ride hard the paint? You think that they deserve every bit of the praise they've gotten? Let us know in the comments below. If there are albums from that year that you think are underrated that we haven't mentioned today, then let us know in the comments as well. Let us know what you think of the albums from that year that you just don't quite agree with the hype on, more or less. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll be back again soon with another video. If you enjoyed this and want to support us directly for just $1 a month, you can hit the join button, become a member of the Jams and Tea family, get your name in the title crawl of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to listen to, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Goldfish, the snack that smiles back.